There we are. All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at a special topic. It has to do with replications that we've looked at, but it also has to do with the sort of special nature of a particular area of psychology, which is social psychology. So before we get to that, two brief announcements. Number one is the course evaluations. So the course evaluations are now available, and course evaluations are a great way for the faculty here to get feedback from you to let us know specifically what about a course did you find helpful, what about a course helped you to learn the material, did you find beneficial, and also what about a course might not have been helpful, something that you didn't particularly benefit from. It's a great way for us to get feedback because we need to know when we're designing a course, what to include and what to do in there, and also when we're designing a course, what to exclude and what not to do in that course. So if you could do those course evaluations, I'll give you two hopefully good reasons to motivate you. One is this idea of your civic duty to future students. So we, the faculty, do take that information and we modify our courses with regard to that information as well. So for example, the online version of this course right now where you have the e-text and you have a lot of the assignments online, that was partly done in response to course evaluations. So to help make this course better for future generations, we would very much appreciate your feedback. And if that's not motivation enough, I will also be giving a bonus percent towards your final grade. So 1% towards your final grade for completing a course evaluation. And I will open up a tab in Canvas. It will be an assignment in the assignment tabs where you can upload a confirmation screenshot of your course evaluation. If you've already completed it, you should be able to see a list of the courses that you've completed course evaluations for, and you can upload that screenshot. So just bear that in mind if you haven't already. Make sure that you complete those and then upload that screenshot for a percent towards your final grade, and for the peace of mind of helping future students and helping the faculty improve this particular course. So that was one of the announcements I wanted to get to. The other one has to do with what is coming up next week, and that is the final exam. So this is the final week of classes right now. We have our final exam this Tuesday, December 17th. And it's a final exam in name only. It's really just exam number 4, so it's not cumulative. It's going to cover the following chapters and lectures. So it's going to cover Chapter 11, the single case quasi-experimental chapter, Chapter 14, generalization, and then now what we're taking a look at, or today and next time, ethics in behavioral research. So it'll cover those 3 chapters. The lectures that it'll cover are the following ones. So these are basically the lectures immediately after Exam 3. So we got critical thinking, quasi-independent variables. We got week 13. Week 14 does not have 14-2, class 2, because that was Thanksgiving. And then week 15 does not have the first class because that was the get your research paper ready, student-driven optional review session. And then we have today's class, and then next class we're going to be looking at ethics, and we're going to be visiting the Stanford prison experiment to see the ethical violations there. So that's the content of the final exam. The format of it is going to be the same as we've had previously. So it's going to have 2 sections. Section number 1 covers materials from the readings that we don't have time to cover in class, unfortunately. That's going to be worth 33% of your score on the exam, and it'll only have recognition type questions. Section number 2 covers materials that we did get a chance to cover in class, did have a chance to cover in the lectures, and that is 66% of your score, and it will also include recognition and application type questions. All right, any questions about the final exam? It's going to take place during class time on Tuesday, and you'll have a little bit of extra time, but you won't need it because it won't be any bigger than a regular exam. Oh, and there will be a bonus logic puzzle, as always, at the end of that one. All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at the curious case of social psychology. We're just going to very quickly wrap up the idea of replications by taking a look at replications that are important, important examples of replications outside of the psychology lab. And then we will introduce some issues in social psychology. We're going to take a look at the Milgram Experiment. We're going to take a look at the Asch Experiment, two very important social psychology experiments. We're going to take a look at the Bystander Effect and the Afterimage Effect. And then we're going to use that to illustrate the idea of the principle of the uniformity of nature, a very important basic assumption that underlies all of science. And we're going to see how that is a special issue for social psychology. All right, so before we get to that social psychology aspect, just wanted to wrap up our look at replications. We looked at it last time with the different types of replications and boundary conditions. And there actually is replications in the real world. And the Me Too movement actually provided some real life examples of the importance of replications and also of the importance of false memory. So if you're ever wondering what the impact might be of the work that we're doing here, it was very well illustrated and strongly illustrated in the retrial of Bill Cosby. So when Bill Cosby first went to trial, he wasn't acquitted, it wasn't a mistrial, it was a hung jury. There was a hung jury for the first trial. They could not come to a verdict, they could not convict. So he was retried later, and this time he was found guilty on, 3 counts of sexual assault. So we can see first here the idea of replication. He was tried once, they didn't reach any verdict. He was tried a second time, they came up with a guilty verdict that time. So that sort of replicability or lack of replicability calls into question certain areas of law and justice and how the legal system is actually operating. So that's the idea of replications. It is also a very nice example of the importance of false memories, because in the trial, Bill Cosby's accuser denies that she was framing him in retrial. This is Andrea Constand, and she was one of the key witnesses in this retrial. And much of her testimony depended upon what happened on a single night when she visited Cosby's estate. And she mentioned that when she came to the house, she phoned ahead to have him unlock the gates so that she could come in. And they checked her phone records. So it goes, Constant told police in 2015 that she called Cosby from a university-issued cell phone just before she arrived at his house on the night of the alleged assault to ensure the gate would be open. But Constant's phone records show she did not make any calls to Cosby's mansion that month. Constant explained that she may have been mistaken, that there were times Cosby told her in advance that the gate would be open and she often reached him at another number. So this is an example of a false memory. So our understanding of false memories indicate that you can make an error like this with not an intentional lie. So the one interpretation of this is that she's intentionally lying. She's intentionally trying to frame him because she is saying that she remembers something occurring when it actually didn't occur. And in one understanding of how memory works, that can only happen with an intentional lie. With our understanding now of how memory works, we know that memory is reconstructive. We know that false memories can come out of information that is reconstructed in this way. So we know that even though that was not the case, it does not mean that she is intentionally lying about the incident. It's just that her mind has created this particular false memory. So just another kind of public service announcement for the importance of showing people lists of words in a room and asking them to recall it can have massive implications, in this case, whether somebody ends up going to jail or not. All right, so on to social psychology now. So what we're going to do is we're first going to take a look at some findings in social psychology, some classic research done in social psychology, and we're going to start with the Milgram Experiment. So for the Milgram Experiment, this is going to be a reenactment, a replication of the experiment that was done for a BBC program back about 10 years ago. And we're going to take a look at the video of it. And just so that, just for a little bit of context, this is the public announcement that was placed in newspapers for the particular Milgram experiment to recruit subjects for the Milgram experiment. So it's interesting, though, that they were paid $4 for an hour of your time, and apparently that was a lot, because you can see it's here big and bold in the title there. And you also got 50 cents car fare as soon as you got to the laboratory. So just a little bit of context in terms of what it was like back in 1960 something. But what we're going to see now is what the Milgram experiment would be like today in modern times, and we'll see a little bit about that information. All right, so we'll stop it right there. So that was the Milgram experiment, and it's a great example of one of the reasons why we do experiments like this, because when psychologists initially tried to predict how many people would go all the way to the end, all the way to delivering lethal shock, I think the leading psychologists came up with an estimate of 0.1 of 1%. Like literally 1 in 1,000 people would go all the way. And what they found is very regularly 2/3 up to 3/4 of people go all the way to that extreme shock. So they have replicated the Milgram experiment over and over and over again. So the original one, 2/3 of people went all the way. In this replication of the Milgram experiment, 3/4 of people went all the way. But the question that I'm going to pose to you right now, and you don't have to answer this out loud, but just kind of answer it for yourself, is that now that you have seen this particular show, now that you have seen the Milgram experiment, how many of you think that you would actually have delivered or would deliver a shock if you're placed in a similar situation? And what I mean by this is that having seen this show and having seen the Milgram experiment, if you are now in an experiment where you were required to harm another individual because the experimenter said, well, it has to continue, the experiment requires that you continue, how many of you think you would actually deliver the maximum shock? Or alternatively, change your behavior because you are now aware of the Milgram experiment and you're now aware of what occurred in that particular experiment. So just answer that for yourselves for the time being, and I will queue up the next experiment to show here, and this one is the Asch Experiment. And the Asch Experiment is another classic social psychology experiment. So let's take a look at that in this brief demonstration right now.
The Asch Experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3. 3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along. 1. 1. 1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
1. 1.
All right, so that was the Asch experiment. And now in this case, we have another kind of classic social psychology experiment. But once again, this naive subject acted in a certain way because he was unaware of the principles of conformity. He was unaware of this kind of Asch experiment. So the question I want to ask again is that now that you have seen this clip, now that you're aware of the Asch effect and the Asch experiment, how many of you think you would conform in a similar situation? How many of you think that in a similar experimental situation, when it was clear that everybody was getting the wrong answer, that you yourself, having seen this, would not stick to your guns and would actually change your answer in response to that social conformity effect? All right, so once again, no need to answer out loud, just kind of take a personal inventory on that. And we're going to take a look at one more example of a social psychology effect, and this is the bystander effect. So once again, let's take a look at what this is all about.
Place like this street in New York City, if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill. How long before he gets help? Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help, and it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Four minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
People don't really want to listen all the time. Well, they have got the time, they just want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit sleepy, you know.
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
Well, shut up. You alright, yeah? Sure.
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
What did you say?
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
Why your man is short in brain?
Because he's part of the right group. Everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helped him walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay. I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill. He's going to ruin the suit anyway.
All right, so that's the bystander effect. And once again, kind of take an internal inventory on this and ask yourself, now that you have seen this clip, how many would pass up somebody who was in need of assistance in a similar situation? How many of you, now that you know about the bystander effect, would actually walk by somebody that required assistance? And again, take that personal inventory. But for this one, this is one that has actually changed my behavior. So I know that because of my knowledge of the bystander effect, if I hear crashes outside in the hallway, I have paused class to stick my head out the window, out the door, and basically ask, are you all right? Are you okay? And it has changed my behavior simply because I know of this particular study, I know about this particular effect, I'm aware of that aspect of psychology. All right, so we're going to take a look at one more demonstration, and this is the Afterimage Effect. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to stare at the black dot on the following slide. So right in the center of the slide, there's a black dot, and I'm going to come over here on this side so I can join in too. And what I want you to do is stare at the black dot and fixate on it for, I think it's about 30 seconds, and then the screen is going to change, and I want you to note your experience when the picture changes. Very importantly, stay fixated on that center dot, and we'll see if we can get the effect. All right, so there's the center dot. So fixate on that, stare right at it. And the slide will automatically change. Fight your urges to look away. All right, so hands up if you saw color when the picture changed. Okay, all right. So that's called the Afterimage Effect. And what the Afterimage Effect is it's basically when you stare at a color, it makes your neutral point, whatever your visual system determines as your neutral point as being gray, it shifts it towards the opposite color. So if you stare at, for example, yellow, or if you have yellow on a certain part of your retina, then when you see gray, it changes gray to appear blue. And if you see purple on a certain part of your retina, when it goes to gray, it changes that into green. So it changes it into whatever the opposite color is on the other side of your retina. Because the second picture that popped up was a black and white picture. It was a grayscale picture of this tower in England. And by staring at this image first, when that grayscale image popped up, you perceived color even though color wasn't there. So it was an illusion that was created by staring at this, image initially. So what I want to do right now is let's try this again. But this time, follow the exact same instructions, stare at the black dot, keep fixating on it, don't look away. But this time when the picture changes, try to use the information that you now have about the fact that it's a black and white picture and try to stop your visual system from perceiving the color when that picture changes. So let's see if we can use the knowledge of what we know now about this Afterimage effect to basically see the truth and not the illusion of this effect. All right, so let's try that again. So stare at that dot. Maintain your fixation. Don't look away. When it changes, try to see the black and white image, not see any color. All right, okay, I failed. Anybody else see color? Yeah, okay. So everybody saw color because that's the way a visual system works. So even after that explanation, you still saw the after image. And even, I mean, I did a postdoc on color perception. So I know more about color perception than your typical psychologist. And even I cannot stop myself from seeing color when it shifts to that particular image. So on the one hand, we have studies like this, effects like this, where knowledge does not seem to influence a person's behavior. You still see this as color, even if you know everything about how your visual system works. On the other hand, we have effects like the Bystander Effect and the Milgram Effect, where knowledge of that particular effect actually changes your behavior in that effect, or in that phenomenon. So we seem to have these two different types of psychological effects. And the reason for that has to do with one of the basic assumptions of science, and this is the principle of the uniformity of nature. So the principle of the uniformity of nature, this is a basic assumption that underlies all of science. It underlies psychology, it underlies physics, it underlies chemistry, it underlies biology. It is one of the basic assumptions that science is built upon. And what it says, it was explicitly identified by philosopher David Hume. And what it says is, to do science, we make the assumption that what has happened in the past will continue to happen in the future. That is a basic assumption that we have to make that cannot be proven using science. So we believe that what has happened in the past will continue to happen in the future. So we base our science on the things that we found yesterday are going to remain true tomorrow, that our universe will stay uniform in nature, that it will not change, that it will not somehow shift into new rules or new sorts of ways of operating. So that's a basic assumption that underlies all of science. And if you take a look at certain examples from science, you can see that it seems to be true of some examples of science. So for example, in physics, E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. That was true yesterday. So when they tested it after Einstein came up with this equation, they tested it and they found that, yeah, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So it was true yesterday. If you went to the CERN super collider today and you tested this out, or if you went to another physics laboratory and tested this out, you would find that this equation is also true today. And the assumption is that, yes, it will continue to be true tomorrow. So 20 years from now, 30 years from now, if you tested E equals mc squared, the idea is that you would find out that, yes, E equals mc squared. So we have that in physics. In chemistry, we have the chemical formula that H2O, two hydrogens and an oxygen, that equals water. And that was true yesterday. So if you went back in time and you analyzed some water, you would find out it's H2O. And it's true today. If we went outside and got water from the fountain, you would find out it is H2O. And the idea is that it's going to be true tomorrow as well. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, you're going to pour yourself a glass of water and water will still be H2O. So you can see that what has happened in the past will continue to happen in the future, underlies this idea of science telling us that H2O is water. And another phenomenon that we have in psychology, staring at red makes white appear green. So that idea of the after image effect. Well, this was true yesterday. So when these studies were initially done in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, people staring at red and then looking at a white wall made them perceive green, and it's how we kind of learned about the color channels. As we saw, it is true today. So the after image that you saw today works on that same principle. And I would be pretty confident that 10 years from now, if I do this demonstration for students, they'll still see a colored castle. 20 years from now, they'll still see a colored castle. 50 years from now, they'll still see that after effect of that color image for the castle. So it seems to be fitting this principle of the uniformity of nature. It seems to be fitting that assumption. However, people will deliver lethal shocks because an authority figure tells them to. That was true yesterday. So that was true in the past, right? The Milgram experiment has been replicated a lot. The question is it still true today, right? Is it still the case that people today will still deliver lethal shocks to an individual just because an authority figure tells them to? And is it going to be true tomorrow? Will society change in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years so that this type of behavior no longer occurs? And that's an indication about the sort of special nature of social psychology, because the principle of the uniformity of nature is the assumption that your universe is not changing. So the universe that we're studying is not changing, and that's why we can study it in the past and make predictions about it in the future. But for social psychology, according to them, society is what determines behavior. In effect, the society is the universe that shapes your behavior. And in that case, society being the universe of social psychology is an issue because society is actually constantly changing. So if you take a look at, just for example, that Milgram replication, one of the things that the psychologist mentioned 10 years ago, this was in 2009, one of the things that the psychologist mentioned is the idea that, well, people are doing this because they believe science to be a force for good. They believe that there's an obligation to science. They believe that there's an obligation to help people and that science helps people. And we can see cracks in that idea forming in our society today with things like the anti-vaccination movement, with things like the flat earth movement, which is proposing some sort of scientific conspiracy to say that we're actually on a flat earth. We see all these sort of conspiracy theories coming up. We see things like big pharmacy and big medicine lying to the public. We see those ideas. We don't have that authority of science as much as we do now in our society. So is that enough to change that behavior in the Milgram experiment? And also, is knowledge as it permeates our society, is that enough to also change behavior, for example, in the Milgram experiment? I would argue, and I'll provide some evidence, that it is, because again, society is the universe for social psychology, and society is continually changing. Any questions on the idea of the principle of the uniformity of nature? All right, so let's take a look. So if the principle of the uniformity of nature, it might not apply to social psychology. If it doesn't apply to social psychology, then we have a big issue in terms of our ability to understand social psychology. So the first kind of piece of evidence for this, and this is, we've touched on this before, is the idea of failures to replicate. So psychology, specifically social psychology, has a replication problem, and we've seen this graph before, but as you can see, we have a replication rate here, so successful replications of about 54% or 50%, depending upon the criteria that you're using. This literally says that 50% of the time, what happened in the past is not happening in the present. 50% of the time, what we found occurred in the past is not occurring here in the present. So that is an issue that violates that principle of the uniformity of nature. It violates that idea of social psychology having that principle of the uniformity of nature. And as you can see, many of these are social psychology studies. So things like position in power, moral cleansing, disgust and homophobia, priming consumerism, the trolley dilemma. A lot of those are social psychology questions. All right, so does society actually change enough? So we know that society changes. The life that people were leading in the 1950s is not the life that they're leading right now. The life that people are leading right now, the society we live in, is not going to be the society we're in the next 20 years. Especially these days, it seems like society is changing more rapidly than ever. So the question then becomes, is it changing enough, right? Does society actually change enough to fundamentally change our behavior? So we're going to take a look at a few examples that I would argue indicate that yes, it is changing enough. And we're going to start off with a look at transhumanism. So transhumanism, this is a relatively new movement. Relatively new in terms of it being identified, but not relatively new in the terms that we've all sort of been part of transhumanism to varying degrees. But this is basically using technology to enhance human capacities. So if you store your friends' contact numbers on your cell phone rather than having them memorized in your brain, you are using technology to enhance your human capacities. You are part of this transhumanistic movement. We are reaching an age today where transhumanism is going to become a big kind of factor that can change our potential behavior. So, for example, does anybody know who this athlete is? His name is Oscar Pistorius. Does the name ring a bell? Yep.
Does he have not like the word mechanical legs, basically?
Yeah. So that's him right there. He is his nickname was the Blade Runner because he was a double amputee, and he would compete in track and field events. And he was called the Blade Runner because he ran on these blades. And he made headlines for two reasons. The good reason was, and you can Google the bad one, but the good reason was that he competed in the Paralympics, but his times in his events were fast enough that he actually qualified for the 2012, I believe, Olympics, like just straight Olympics, not Paralympics. Here he is running against people with normal legs. He almost was not allowed. So even though he had times that were fast enough to qualify for the Olympics, he was almost not allowed to compete in the Olympics. Does anybody know what the argument was against him competing in the Olympics? Can anybody guess? Mm-hmm.
His legs give him an unfair advantage.
The argument was that his legs were too good, that his legs were better than human legs were, and it gave him an unfair competitive advantage. That his legs were too springy, that they did not require as much metabolic energy because you don't have to pump blood to these robotic legs. You don't have to, waste calories to move them along. They basically made the argument, to put it in simple terms, that these legs were better than these legs, and that it was unfair of him to compete. Now, eventually he did compete, but the very fact that for the first time in our human existence, these transhumanism technology augmented abilities of a human being were considered to be better than the actual physical human legs. That has not happened before. That is new territory that we're just diving into. And speaking of new territory, if you've ever seen Star Trek The Next Generation, you'll know this guy here. This is Geordi LaForge, and he is blind. He has something was wrong with his eyes, so he's visually blind in his eyes, but his visual cortex is fine. So what he has is he has this visor implant, and the visor can analyze the electromagnetic spectrum and then translates it into electrical impulses that go directly into his brain. And in that way, he can see the world. And in reality, he can see better than any human. So he can see the infrared spectrum, he can see the ultraviolet spectrum. So many times they went on away missions, and Geordi, everybody would just look around the ship and they'd be like, oh yeah, this is fine. And Jordy would be like, oh no, I see structural damage everywhere and we have to get out of here. We got about 20 seconds before this place goes down. His vision was better than human vision. We're not quite there yet with this, but we are getting there with hearing. So this is a cochlear implant, and much like this visor that took visual information and changed it into electrical impulses that got fed directly into the cortex, this cochlear implant takes in auditory information, translates it into electrical impulses, and then sticks that directly into your cortex. And they actually have that for children as young as infants. So let's take a look at it in action. So this is a 8-month-old baby who was deaf. In this case, nothing is wrong with the brain, something is wrong with the ears, and this technology is bypassing the ears and going directly into the brain.
Here we go, it's coming back on, and he's back on again. See how he turns?
Hi, Jonathan. Hi. Did you hear that? Hi, sweetie. Could you hear that? Hi. Hi.
You got that, Dad, right?
Hi, Jonathan. Hi.
We call that a late Christmas present.
Hi. Good job.
That's really good.
All right, so we have the child has a cochlear implant, and it used to be science fiction. It's getting to be science fact, and the effect of this, once again, is going to be something that is new to psychology. The social effects of this are going to be something that's new to psychology. So just like Oscar Pistorius' legs were deemed to be too good to compete in the Olympics, they were unfair to compete in the Olympics. How long are we before enhancements like this are actually better than our own human auditory mechanisms? So just to kind of give you a kind of timeline, this is what our human ear looks like today, right? This is our human ear right now. And this is what cochlear implants look like today. So this is the state of technology in the current time. If you go back, let's be very generous. Let's say we go back 100 years. This is what the technology for helping somebody with a hearing impairment looked like. It was you put a cone to your ear and you asked people to speak directly into the cone. That's where the technology was. What were our ears like? That's what our ears were like. So notice, no change, right? In 100 years, our ears have gotten no better. In 100 years, this technology has changed into this technology. How much more time are we going to need before the trajectory of this technological revolution surpasses the ability of this listening device? So that is a question that we have not encountered yet, and it's also a question that really we have it's a social psychology question that we have no idea what's going to happen. So does anybody kind of can speculate in terms of what things are going to change if this cochlear implant just keeps getting better and better and better and better? So what are some of the things that might change?
People might start having them, like paying to have them implanted for them to hear better, even if they can hear fine normally.
Right, so one thing that might change is that people might start equipping themselves with that, whether or not they have a hearing impairment. Because if you have the ability to hear better, Just the same way that not being able to hear will impact your behavior and decrease your, for example, competitiveness in certain situations, being able to hear better would increase your competitiveness in certain situations. Be able to pick up on people's heartbeats, to know if they're lying or if they're not lying. Be able to pick up on people's breathing patterns, because you can hear them across the table in a negotiation situation. So being able to super perceive all of these indications, people would start getting these implants even if they didn't need them. The same way that years ago there was a sort of crisis of parents coaching their children to fake ADHD symptoms so that they can get prescribed Ritalin to turn a normal child into a super focused child so they can study 8 hours a day and get into Harvard without, paying the money in the admission scandal. But basically, that would be one of the things that occurs. Another thing that would occur, what would happen to privacy? What would happen to our society if literally I can hear everything that is going around? What's going to happen to divided attention? What's going to happen to stress levels if you can hear so much information, if you can't find a place of peace and quiet anymore? If going down the hallway you can hear nothing but conversations. Sure, you can turn it off, but how is that behavior going to affect us? And I will be honest with you, I don't think humans and people and scientists really understand how technology is going to affect us, because when the internet came out and everybody was like, oh my gosh, what's the internet going to do? How's the internet going to change us? How is, when cell phones came out, how are cell phones going to change us? How's all this going to change us? Not one psychologist, not one scientist, not one futurist made the prediction that we would become obsessed with cat videos and we would take photos of our food, right? Nobody predicted that. And yet here we are watching cat videos and posting it to Instagram every single meal that we've had for the last 5 years. So we don't know, we have no idea, but it's a social psychology question, and the society, the universe of social psychology is in for a drastic change. So to give you one last example of this, in terms of the society change nearly enough, we are going to, I had a few more examples, but this one will give us a good sort of basis for this. Does society actually change enough? We're going to take a look at the Milgram Experiment one more time. And this time around, I want you to pay attention to two things. First off, and this is going to tie into our discussion of ethics next time, pay attention to the amount of harm that is occurring to the subjects that are doing the Milgram Experiment. Take a look for signs of anxiety, for signs of stress, and in one case, literally a mention that they were deeply disturbed by it. And then also take a look for signs for one particular subject who knew about the Milgram Experiment, and take a look at her reaction to this particular situation.
For experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1963 to look at how normal people can commit atrocious acts simply because they're following orders. Milgram's parents were Jewish refugees in World War II, and his pioneering work speaks volumes about the nature of responsibility. It's being filmed with covert cameras. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to fast forward a little bit because we're running a bit low on time.
He's been asked a series of memory questions by the teacher. He will have to load pairs and then correctly remember them when offered multiple choices.
If the answer is incorrect, you will receive an electric shock.
The teacher is then taken next door and shown the generator, which ranges from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts. The domestic electricity supply in the UK is, of course, 240 volts. Our teachers are given the list of questions and told to increase the voltage each time the learner gets a question wrong. They are then given an example of a low voltage shock.
And try and estimate in volts the amount of shock you're getting.
Okay.
Do you know how much that was?
75.
It's actually 45.
Oh my god.
Did you get?
Shoe horn steam. The point of this test is to see whether the teachers, our subjects, will call a stop to the experiment or continue to the point where they are administering seemingly lethal electric shocks to the victim simply because the scientist is telling them to.
That's correct. The next one is bicycle. The options tyre, race, helmet, shorts. That's incorrect, so there'll be 120 volts. I think we'll do this anymore.
If you could continue, please, teacher.
There is none of them we do anymore.
The experiment requires you to continue.
Yeah, even so, I don't think I'm going to do anymore.
Correct. According to plan, our accomplice provided many wrong answers. Each protest was coordinated to a particular shock voltage on the generator, and his responses were played via a CD.
That's wrong, 150 volts.
The correct answer is Captain Shoe. Cup. That's wrong. 225 volts. He's in a lot of pain.
Continue, please.
But he's not comfortable.
We must continue to the end of the experiment. We'll learn a lesson what he has to go on till he's learned works correctly.
Okay.
All right, so this is a nice example. You can see the deep inhales of breath, the sighs, the hand to the face,
That's wrong.
indications
240
that
volts.
he's starting to feel the stress.
Are you sure it's not causing any lasting damage? He sounds like he's in a lot of pain.
Well, the shots might be painful, they're not harmful.
What does that mean, though? They're not harmful. Sorry, I'm not getting you. When you say that they might be painful but not harmful,
It causes no long-term damage.
because does that mean that there doesn't leave any scars?
It causes no damage.
That seems very cold and calculated to me. This doesn't seem like a very. Anyway, golden. That's wrong, mate. 300 volts. Staple. The options are diet, jar, balcony, bowl.
So this is a nice example here too. So just look at the relief in his body. He realizes this person's no longer answering, and he leans back and he's sitting there. He's like, oh, well, I'm out. I'm free. I'm done. So there's relief. And then notice what happens when he finds out that he's not done.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, say 4 to 5 seconds, then you have to treat the answer as wrong and follow that procedure.
He's shocked. He's back in.
Did you hear
He's
that?
back under stress.
Just any response, mate. Come on. What guess?
Please continue.
345 volts. If you're still with me, I'm sorry. I can't do this, honestly. Can we stop this experiment? Because I can't do this.
If we don't continue, we'll have to discontinue the experiment.
Yeah, okay, fine. That's fine. I'm not going to do this.
And the experimenter actually made a mistake there, because instead of saying it has to continue, he said, well, if you don't continue, we have to discontinue. So he discontinued the experiment. So he actually gave him an out, which allowed him to relieve himself of the stress and avoid any other harm.
Incorrect. 405 volts. volts. Sorry, I don't know. Someone will check on him. It says he's not making any noise now, he was before. I'm quite happy to go on, but I'm just a little bit worried about if you would continue. Yeah, I'm just a bit worried because he was like he was like complaining before about that. But no harm. But he's not making any noise now. It's essential that we continue with the experiment. Balcony. Incorrect. 450 volts. We promise he's not. Why let's continue with the procedure. You say it hurts, but it's because it's like.
So he's lost his ability to form complete sentences. He's under that much stress right now. But he continues.
I think just continue the experiment now.
All of the subjects were told the true nature of the experiment was to see how they would respond to authority, and that it would eventually form part of the show.
It is okay. I can tell you, yeah, it's absolutely fine. You weren't administering electric shocks at all.
And then you can see the relief. The relief that they find out that they didn't actually do what they thought they did. And that only occurs if you are under massive amounts of stress.
How many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board? Their prediction was 1/10 of 1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
So after the results of the Milgram experiment, I've now chosen my 4 subjects that will go forward for the heist.
And I want bombs.
Phil was impressively resourceful when he was caught stealing sweets, and held in his anguish during the Milgram and Defiant Scientist. I did want to include a woman in the group. Jen was the only subject to take a long time to recover after the Milgram experiment, so I felt I shouldn't use her.
All right, so that is a perfect example of why we're going to be considering ethics next class, because not only was she harmed during the experiment, but she took a long time to recover after the experiment. So the potential for harm in a psychology experiment is both in the experiment and after the experiment. And we're going to see that there are safeguards that are put into place to make sure that people in an experiment like this don't get harmed. But the key for today is coming up in just a moment. I know we're running out of time.
Steal from the shop, so that left Vicky.
Vicky.
Of all the subjects, she was the only one to have known the original Milgram experiment.
She's the only one that knew the original Milgram experiment. She's the only one that had knowledge of the original Milgram experiment. And take a look at her behavior compared to everybody else's.
And call a halt to her involvement in it.
Can I just say, I can't do this because I've heard of this experiment before.
All right, so this is an exact example of how knowledge can change your behavior. Everybody else is stressing, everybody else is anxious, everybody else is super conflicted. Vicky, on the other hand, her behavior is completely different. Why? Because she knows about the Milgram experiment. She just said, look, I know this experiment before, I'm calling a halt to my behavior. So as society changes, and as, very importantly, the ideas of psychology get put into our general cultural awareness. So I had examples, we're not going to have a time to get to it, but the Bystander Effect has been in shows like Law and Order, it's been in the Boondock Saints, it's been in the movie Kick-Ass, it's been in the comic book The Watchmen. It's been permeating through society. Milgram's experiment has been in movie form and it's been permeating society. The more people know about it, the more that information is going to change their behavior. The more society changes, the less what we learned about social psychology in the past is going to be true in the future, and that is that special challenge for social psychology. All right, so that is all that I wanted to cover for today, or at least that's all that we are going to cover for today. So we'll meet for the last time in class next time. And just a note, if you have handed in your research paper, make sure that you've submitted it to both Canvas and Turnitin. So if you've already submitted it to one, I'll take that as your date of submission. But do make sure that you've submitted it to both. I use both sources when I'm grading, so please do that. Other than that, we are done for today.